Vince is just so interesting. He's such an interesting guy. The fact that he's driven for so long, this guy's been just fucking getting after it for so long. And just lives and breathes this idea of crafting narratives and figuring out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and how to set up a storyline.
And paying attention to what's happening politically, what's happening, tapping into that, trying to always have his finger on the pulse of what's happening.
I can see how he tried the thing about you smiling all the time. You got a great smile. Friendly, good-looking guy. Why not? Have a smile.
It's smile.
See if people like it.
And you know what he said? He goes, I'm going to give you a push, but I want to make sure people, if you smile, then people will know you're grateful. And I was like, okay, I get the conceit of that. Right. But there's other ways I think I can be grateful because otherwise I'm coming across as being a phony, and that's just not who I am. So, and by the way, years later, or even months later, I mean, he admitted, he said, I totally get it. Now I understand. Always got to be.
Did Japanese pro wrestling come out of American pro wrestling, or was it a separate thing that evolved on its own?
I think it was a separate thing that evolved on its own. Well, I think everything evolved out of American wrestling. That started off in the carnivals, started off in catch wrestling and things like that, which eventually evolved to one of MMA techniques.
So the carnivals, for people who don't know, literally they'd have traveling carnivals where someone would take on anyone in the crowd.
That's right.
And these were real wrestlers, real catch wrestlers who knew submissions, and they would, you know, pin guys and get them in ankle cranks. And
and so the thing that started going sideways, which required a Vince McMahon type. Well, wait a second, we're not doing this right. Because these guys who were just these fucking badasses, you know, they go to the carnival, you know, $10, $5, you come in and try your luck if you could beat the champion. The champion beat the shit out of all of these guys. But every once in a while, you got a guy who came in out of the blue, off the street, who knew how to protect himself and hold his own, might have known a hold or two, and wind up beating the champion. And this started to happen, and before you know it, a promoter or promoters or whether it's the fighters, whoever it was, the wrestlers possibly, but someone was like, hold on a second. We need to work this because otherwise we're running a risk at us getting fucked up. Like, what if we took the show on the road?
Right.
So that's how this idea of pro wrestling out of the carnival started to happen.
It's really interesting because wrestling itself is one of the most dynamic and difficult amateur sports, but they never really figured out a way to take actual competitive wrestling and make it a legitimate professional sport that's watched by people, which is really insane because it's so exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, so many people don't play tennis, but they still enjoy watching tennis.
That's right.
How is it that wrestling never got to that place? And I think it's probably because of the carnival wrestling, pro wrestling became a thing that everybody kind of knew was entertainment.
Yes.
And it became all these characters and Killer Kowalski and all these guys that were like, you know, I'm going to rip his throat out and shit down his neck. And everybody, and the crowd goes nuts.
Yeah.
And to try to have just actual, like, freestyle wrestling become a sport where you're competing for cash prizes like you would do with tennis or something else. I never made it there, which doesn't make any sense to me because so many people wrestle, so many people appreciate wrestling. Wrestling is the cornerstone of MMA. It's one of the most important. I think the most important, because if a guy is a kickboxer and he doesn't know how to wrestle, wrestlers are just going to take him down and beat the fuck out of him every single fight. Wrestlers can decide whether the fight stands or goes to the ground because once they grip you, you ain't doing shit.
That's right.
You're going to get ragdolled. That's just a fact. And for whatever reason, boxing has a legitimate professional application. There's even professional karate. There's all these different things. But wrestling as a competition, an actual athletic competition, never took traction professionally.
No, it didn't. And as you were saying, I think the cachet and the entertainment value just started to become more appealing, I think, to people. And if you think about it, back in the early 1920s and 30s and at that time where fucking times were tough and people were trying to stretch the dollar, what do I want to go see? I want to go see this wrestling event. It feels like, and plus those matches, they would work those matches where they're fucking hour and a half, like a long matches too as well.
Crazy.
But I will say one of the most important elements, which I know you'll appreciate, and a lot of MMA fighters appreciate, is as you say, wrestling's a cornerstone of MMA, but also for decades and decades and decades, and even still today, having a great base of wrestling is important. Even though there's antics and showmanship and this guy's jumping off this thing and going to the building and bringing the car in and doing all this shit, there's still the basics of wrestling is always very important because, as you know, with catch wrestling, like it taught a lot of wrestling, and myself included because I came up old school, to have real respect for the holds and to be able to get out of holds, put people in holds, know how to work them or know how to apply them where you fuck someone up if you had to. So I always appreciate that about the basics of pro wrestling.
Did you ever amateur wrestle?
So, dude, yes. So, especially in Pennsylvania, I got there in Allentown, the whole area in Pennsylvania, as you know, like they're great wrestlers coming out of Pennsylvania and Ohio. But I love pro wrestling. So I was 15 years old. Wrestling coach, who was also the football coach, was like, "Yeah, why don't you come out, right, for wrestling? You come from a wrestling family." I'm like, "Yeah, great." And I had this thought in my head, "I'm gonna fucking kill this." Great.
Right.
Because my dad was working my ass out on the mats when I was 5, right? And the Von Erichs were working me out when I was 5, right? And so I had this base, holds, lockups, everything. And my first wrestling practice, I was like, fuck. This is the most boring shit I've ever felt in my life. And I told my guys I was like, guys, because I was just so now conditioned. Now, of course, it's the hardest fucking sport out there.
It's the hardest sport.
Hardest fucking sport. I have so much respect for it. But you know what it was? It was just me at 15. Dude, I love the pile drivers.
Right.
I love the bad guys. I want to be a pro wrestler.
I get
it.
I get it.